The story of the Germanic tribes beyond the Limes border is intrinsically tied to the fate of the Western Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, in its half-millennium of existence in the West, had countless contacts with a large number of different tribes. Some were conquered, some were befriended, others remained fierce enemies. But sometimes it was not so clear-cut if a tribe was a friend, an ally, or an enemy. And one such complicated story of animosity, of friendship, and later of succession is certainly that of the Franks. Where did the Franks come from? When did they start entering the ranks of the Roman army as foederati? And when did they become formidable enemies? Or did they even? And what happened after the Roman Empire fell? The Franks are first attested in the Roman sources during the reign of the Emperor Probus, who reigned from 276 to 282 AD. This emperor campaigned extensively against various Germanic tribes beyond the Limes border, and he was famous for resettling large amounts of them into Roman territory. He also completely obliterated the Lugii, a tribe which was so utterly routed that it would never again play a significant role afterwards. He also restored the lost territory of the Agri Decumates, if only for a short period of time, and he resettled Franks to the northern Gallic coastline, we are informed, which is when the Franks are first mentioned as its own separate tribe. It is however clear though that the Franks existed before that, but it was only then that they were mentioned by the Romans as an own tribe. But we must be aware that the Franks was probably a term coined for a certain agglomeration of Germanic people. In fact, the term referred to a coalition of different sub-tribes. Some of them would later become known as the Salian Franks or the Ripuarian Franks. It is sometimes messy to distinguish between them, so I will use the general term Franks for most of this video. Next, we hear about the Franks in the early age of the Tetrarchy, when the Emperor Constantius, father of Constantine, defeated them utterly across the Rhine, forcing their king to settle for peace and settling many Franks near Augusta Treverorum, modern-day Trier. It was during the 290s in the Tetrarchy that major successes could be won against the barbarians, because for the first time in decades there were no constant usurpations anymore. And it was indeed these constant usurpations and Romans fighting against Romans which allowed the Germanic tribes to even penetrate so deep into Roman territory. So the Tetrarchy really was a boon for the Roman Empire's ability to tackle the Germanic problem. It was Constantine then who is mentioned the next time as defeating the Franks. He campaigned against them in 306 AD, taking a number of Frankish kings captive and condemning them to death in a brutal spectacle in the amphitheater at Augusta Treverorum. In 310, Constantine attacked the Franks again. This time, he had a large bridge over the river Rhine constructed, thus campaigning deep into Frankish territory in western Germania. It was then during this time that some of those Franks would be utterly impressed by the might of the Romans, and many of them would join the Roman army under Constantine. So in the early 300s AD, we first encounter Frankish foederati, and these Frankish soldiers of Constantine would become an important cornerstone of his army. It was indeed these battle-hardened Franks that in no small part made the victory against Maxentius possible in 312 AD. It must be noted that recruitment of Germanics into the auxiliary troops had already been practiced in previous centuries, but the scale of recruitment really started growing strongly in the early 300s, and Constantine's military successes against Maxentius and later against Licinius proved that this strategy was maybe not so bad, hence it got imitated. And so the practice of recruiting Germanic foederati would really become commonplace. We can assume that it was in the early 300s then that this growing Germanic influence would also slowly cause the military equipment and armor of the Romans themselves to change. Indeed, the line between Germanics and Romans started blurring so much that already by the 350s it became difficult to tell a Roman army apart from a barbarian one. While some Franks would fight for the Roman Empire, others would remain fierce enemies. And so only a few decades later, in 355, Franks captured Colonia Agrippina, modern-day Cologne. It was the Emperor Julian himself who freed Cologne from the Franks in 356. Julian will also campaign against the Alemanni, winning a decisive victory against them in 357. But the Franks immediately used that opportunity to invade again, and Julian undertook punitive campaigns into Alemannic and Frankish territory in order to show the strength of Rome and hopefully in order to prevent future attacks, a strategy which actually proved to be successful. We can thus see that while some Franks were probably employed by the Romans even in that time, others were constantly trying to sack and plunder Roman cities along the Rhine River, sometimes even managing to pillage westward deep into the Roman countryside. In 360, when Julian was already Augustus, he campaigned another time against the Franks on the southern Rhine border, defeating many of them and accepting them as settlers into the empire, which granted him the title of Francicus Maximus. Where exactly they were settled, we don't precisely know, but new archaeological findings suggest that many might have been settled in Germania Secunda, an area that had been largely evacuated during the crisis of the 3rd century. And so many of these abandoned cities were now again repopulated with Frankish settlers. The Franks as enemies again vanish from the sources for some time, which means that Julian's and later Valentinian's campaigns deep into Germanic territory certainly had an effect onto the barbarians living beyond the Limes. The Franks by the late 300s were scattered all around. As we saw, Probus and Julian had settled many of them into the Roman Empire, so we can assume that many had become so Romanized that by all accounts they had almost completely been assimilated into the Roman Empire and culture. Others were friendly, but settled still in non-Roman territory across the Rhine. And yet again others remained hostile to Rome and would continue seizing any opportunity to attack the empire. Again others, meanwhile, retained their Germanic identity, but they were fighting for the empire as foederati, some of them even having climbed to high ranks. By the time of Emperor Gratian, one Frank called Ricomeres climbed to the rank of Comes Domesticorum. He even fought for the Romans at the famous Battle of Adrianople in 378. He barely escaped, and later he became Magister Militum per Orientem in the east, and even consul in 384 AD. His nephew was the famous Arbogast, who also became one of the principal officers of the Western Roman Emperor Gratian's field army. Arbogast was instrumental in pushing out the Goths from Thrace following the disaster of Adrianople. Due to these successes, he was made Magister Militum Praesentalis, Magister Militum of the West in the mid-380s, and thus became effective ruler of the western provinces, mainly Gaul, Spain and Britain. Hello dear friends of late Roman history, it's me again, sorry for the interruption. I know the interruptions are getting out of hand lately, I really apologize, but I have a plea. In order to keep Maiorianus the way it is, I really need your help via Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the views on Maiorianus are not really great. Even though we reached this incredible milestone of 100,000 subscribers, the views of the channel are actually really quite low. And since I'm working full-time on Maiorianus, I really need your help in order to keep the channel the way it is. Meaning, in order to keep the channel a niche channel about only late Roman history. Because if not, I will have to do more mainstream topics. I have to make Maiorianus a mainstream Roman history channel. I have to go with the trends. I have to start looking at YouTube trends. I have to do videos about Augustus, about Caesar, about the Roman civil wars, about Hannibal's invasions, about, all the mainstream things that everybody knows about. Because YouTube is a search engine. If more people are interested in a certain topic, you will just get more views. And late Roman history is very, very niche. So basically, I really need your help in order to keep Maiorianus this very fascinating channel which deals about these obscure and unknown topics of the late Roman Empire. I would really appreciate your support so much. Thank you so much, friends of late Roman history, for your support, so that we can keep Maiorianus a channel about late Roman history. Only about late Roman history, about all the reasons, analyzing all the reasons why the Roman Empire fell, every obscure and minute detail that nobody else would be talking about. I want to continue doing that but I really need your support in order to keep Maiorianus the way it is, because we don't want Maiorianus to be turned into a standard general Roman history channel, right? So thank you so much, friends, for your time, and back to the video. So we see how incredibly early the Franks rose to high prominence and how incredibly early the Magister Militum system went bad. Because the actual emperor in those times, Valentinian II, had no real power, since Arbogast only answered to Theodosius and didn't respect the authority of Valentinian. The relationship between Valentinian II and Arbogast deteriorated further, and on May 15, 392 AD, Valentinian II was found dead, hanged in his sleeping quarters. Even though officially declared a suicide, it is not completely unreasonable to suspect that Arbogast had something to do with it. In August 392 then, Arbogast chose Eugenius as new emperor of the Western Roman Empire. And so we see that in the time span of only 80 years, the Franks went from first being recruited in larger numbers into Constantine's army to deciding who would become Western Roman Emperor. A very incredible rise of power indeed. The Roman army, in a time span of not even 100 years, had become, as some would say, quite barbarized. The acclamation of Eugenius did not sit well with the Emperor Theodosius, and so this culminated in the famous Battle of the Frigidus River in 394, a very important battle of world history, about which I talked numerous times. The next time that the Franks would play an important role in the destiny of the Roman Empire was in the weeks following December 31st, 406 AD. As I have mentioned previously, on that famous date, the Vandals first started storming the Roman Limes fortifications, crossing the frozen river Rhine into Roman territory. Many of the Limitanei border troops had been withdrawn from there by the famous Magister Militum Flavius Stilicho, the great defender of Rome, for the defense of Italy. So the Limes was largely only defended by Frankish foederati. Now, fascinatingly, the Franks were so formidable fighters that they actually managed to push back the Vandals. So initially, the fortifications held. 20,000 Vandals were killed in this Frankish Vandalic war of early 407. It was then only later, when other Germanic tribes, such as the Alani and the Suevi, joined the Vandals, that the Franks could be overwhelmed. Only some 20 years later then, the Franks again appeared as enemies. Between 427 and 429, the Salian Franks under their king Clodio took advantage of the Roman civil war between Aetius, Felix and Bonifacius, thus managing to invade the region of Belgica Secunda. We again see the pattern, how the Germanics used Roman civil wars to their advantage, striking almost exclusively only when they knew that the Romans were preoccupied with fighting themselves. It was Aetius then who defeated the Salian Franks in 428, thus restoring Roman power to a large extent in Belgica Secunda. But the precedent of Clodio was set, namely that invading Roman territory in times of civil war would indeed work. Now, why did Clodio invade in the first place? Archaeological evidence points to Belgica and Germania Secunda being sparsely populated, even after the resettlement of many Franks there, and since the territory was already heavily settled by the Franks, and with Roman imperial authority weakening, Clodio probably also wanted a piece of the pie, seeing how all other Germanics had established themselves on territory of the Western Roman Empire. Afterwards, the Franks were content with their territory for quite some time. When the Huns then invaded the Western Roman Empire, the Franks were also part of Aetius' coalition. The Frankish king Childeric was probably an officer in Aetius' army and also helped to defeat Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Childeric himself was thus a Roman foederatus, and so the Franks for the time being were content with the lands in northern Germania and Belgica Secunda. In the early 460s, Aegidius, a general appointed by Emperor Majorian himself, became the Magister Militum per Gallias, and he was a powerful leader with great authority even over the Franks. For a while Childeric was exiled by his own people, Aegidius also took the title King of the Franks. But when Childeric died in 481 AD, his son Clovis took over the lordship over the Salian Franks. And Clovis would not be content anymore with being a foederatus of the Romans, especially now that there was no Western Roman emperor anymore, and imperial authority had collapsed for good. Only Syagrius, the son of Aegidius, remained as the last holdout of Roman control in the west. And Clovis knew that Syagrius was surrounded by Germanic kingdoms, certainly not an ideal situation for the last Western Roman rump state. So therefore, he attacked Syagrius in 486. A battle was fought near Noviodunum Suessionum, today known as Soissons. Syagrius lost but survived the battle and fled, but was killed not long later. And thus the Frankish domain suddenly effectively doubled in size. In those days, the Visigoths were still the dominant power on the former territories of the Western Roman Empire. However, this would change under Clovis. In 496, Clovis defeated the Alemanni and annexed some of their territory across the Rhine. In the early 500s, Armorica was incorporated into the rapidly growing Frankish kingdom, not by military means, because the Armoricans proved to be formidable fighters, but by means of diplomacy. For they shared the common hate of the Visigoths with the Franks, because the Visigoths were Arian Christians, whereas the Franks and the Armoricans were of the Nicene Creed. The Battle of the Vouillé was fought in 507 AD, where the Franks were aided by the Armoricans against the Visigoths, which ended in an overwhelming victory for the Franks, and thus the Frankish kingdom expanded once again, growing to a formidable size. To secure his reign, shortly thereafter, Clovis had many of his possible Frankish rivals brutally executed. And so within the time span of only about 20 years, Clovis had transformed the Franks from possessing only a relatively small area in parts of former Germania and Belgica Secunda to almost the size of modern-day France, an incredible expansion. This was basically the establishment of the Merovingian dynasty as the dominant leader of this new large Frankish kingdom. They saw themselves as the successors of the Roman Empire in the West because it was Childeric, the father of Clovis, a Merovingian who had fought alongside Aetius. In those days, Gaul was still very Romanized, and the cities around 500 AD would not have looked different from, for example, 50 years earlier, when the Roman Empire officially still existed. And even in 751 AD, when the Carolingians took over power over the Frankish kingdom, with Pepin the Short, the son of Charles Martel, being crowned king in that very year, even then they saw themselves as successors of the Romans. Charlemagne himself was an absolute Romabou, as we would say, because he basically tried to resurrect the Roman Empire, both in size and in style. He had many buildings constructed, which used a distinct Roman architectural style, which would not have been out of place even 400 years earlier, such as the famous cathedral at Aachen. Indeed, as I talked about in this video here, many of the old Roman cities, even in those days, were astoundingly well preserved, and so it is understandable why the Franks saw themselves as the natural continuation of the Roman Empire in the West. And so the story of the Franks is an extremely fascinating one. From first appearing during the crisis of the 3rd century, to being recruited in large numbers into Constantine's army, to becoming foederati of the Romans, and thus to quickly ascending the ranks up to the highest offices, to becoming emperor makers, to be sometimes friends, sometimes enemies of Rome, and then later when the Western Roman Empire fell, to quickly expanding in a short time span to a staggering size. Their story is intrinsically interwoven with the late Roman Empire. Sometimes friends, sometimes enemies, but after the fall, some sort of successors of the Romans in the West. A truly fascinating and complex story, which shows how utterly interesting that transition period from the late Roman world to the early medieval world really was. And I would like to take the time to especially thank our new Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Thank you so much, friends, for supporting Maiorianus so that we can keep exploring interesting topics of the late Roman Empire. I would like to thank our new Sol Invictus supporters, Malleus Flavus, Mark Richardson, Neil, Gary Myers, S.K. Hietanen, and Anton Eugene Lantier. Thank you so much, guys, for supporting this channel in such a generous form. Thank you, Malleus Flavus, Mark Richardson, Neil, S.K. Hietanen, Anton Eugene Lantier, and Gary Myers. Thank you so much, guys. I cannot thank you enough. And I would also like to especially thank our two new Restitutor Orbis members, David Pegno and Carrie J. Thank you, David Pegno and Carrie J, for supporting this channel in such an utmost generous way. And I would like to thank our new Augustus supporters, Even Isles and Cookie Monster. Thank you so much, Even Isles and Cookie Monster, for supporting this channel with such generosity. And of course, I would also like to thank our two new Kaisar supporters, Morgan Brewer and William H. Moldestad Jr. Thank you so much, Morgan Brewer and William H. Moldestad Jr., for your amazing support. I thank you so much, friends, for supporting this channel with such generosity so that we can continue making videos about fascinating topics of the late Roman Empire. I cannot thank you enough, friends. I want to thank each and every one who is supporting this channel in any way, shape or form. Gratias tibiago amici. And if you want to learn more about the crossing of the river Rhine in 406 AD, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about how the previously Roman cities probably looked in the early medieval time, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.